Have you ever wanted to know how to make 3D characters feel authentically at home in a 2D world? Well, I've got you covered. We're going to go over our entire character pipeline from concept, animations, to shaders that we use in our upcoming life sim game called Aravale. This one's going to get a little bit dense, so maybe grab a snack or something. Hey there, it's been a while. The last time I did an art devlog, I showed off our process for making 2.5D assets for our game, and boy, were we surprised at the response, with hundreds of thousands of views across all our different social media channels. Honestly, it was kind of hard to keep track of it all, and it actually allowed us to expand our team quite a bit. So many people shared their artwork following that tutorial that we were able to source a lot of amazing talent that accelerated our development quite a bit. A lot of their work can actually be seen in the first look trailer that we put out just a couple months ago. So if you want to check that out, or the devlog that led to it, I'll put a link to both of those down below. So yeah, a lot has happened since then, and I figured we were long overdue for another devlog update. But first, a word from our sponsor, Aravale. For context, Aravale is our cozy life sim in development where you create and care for living characters that we call auras. Customize your home, build your career, and live life with all the drama and crazy moments that come along with it. The twist: guide your aura by writing their goals directly in your own words for much richer emergent stories. It's all built on our agentic game engine that allows anyone to create custom mods, new locations, even whole scenarios to play and share with others, all without needing to know how to code. If that sounds neat to you, I'll have a link to Wishlist it on Steam, and go ahead and give this video a thumbs up for good measure to please the algorithm. All right, back to characters. So the first question you might be asking is just why 3D? Obviously, we've captured a unique and appealing look with our 2D style. Why wouldn't we just apply that same process to our characters? And surprisingly, the answer is the same as the reason we chose 2D for the props: cost. For props, our 2.5D pipeline saves a ton by cutting out huge chunks of what the typical 3D art pipeline would be. You know, high poly sculpting, baking, PBR materials, even the cost of concepting is greatly reduced because the final asset that you see on screen basically is the concept. You don't need to keep retranslating it multiple times in different mediums. Characters, however, have a lot more considerations and can't benefit as easily from those savings. And the reason for that comes down to combinatorics, specifically between the animations, cosmetics, and the rotations. So animation-wise, a character can never really be finished in the same way that a prop can. When we design a prop, it has a known number of animation states that are finite. You know, a toilet flushes, a TV can be turned on and off, doors can be opened and closed. A character, however, may have a finite set of character-to-character interactions, like hug, kiss, slap, but an undefined amount of character-to-prop interactions. You see, for every new prop that we add, we must also have the animations for the character that interacts with it. If we were to do this the 2D way, we'd have a never-ending stream of hand-drawn frames to render, and we'd just never finish our game. Actually, our early prototypes had very lo-fi animations, which used static billboards to represent the props and characters, which kind of like wobbled around to represent walking, and narration lines to indicate what was happening. It was quite charming and cute, and I quite liked it a lot, but as development continued, we realized that what we were really making was more of a Sims-like game, and it was apparent that players of life sims have much higher animation expectations. Because for a life sim, a lot of the fun comes from observing the ant farm, if you will. It's about poking the simulation and seeing the response. The more satisfying that response is, the more fun you have. You can find countless videos on YouTube just analyzing and comparing the animations from different versions of The Sims, all with the same general theme of praising the delightful interactions the characters have with each other and their world. And as a Sims player myself, I totally get it. So we knew we needed to nail that. The second factor is cosmetics. Another pillar of the life sim genre is representation. People want to represent themselves, their friends, their family, and creatively express themselves in the game. Again, if we were to do this the 2D way, not only would we need to animate the character for every single interaction in the game, we'd also need to separately animate each cosmetic item you can wear for every interaction as well, making the infeasible absolutely impossible. Lastly, unlike props, which have 2 to 4 unique directions on average, we knew that characters needed a lot more rotations to feel natural and expressive in the world. So multiply everything that I just said by every angle that we'd want to represent, and you can get a feel for the problem. The good news is traditional 3D pipelines solve a lot of this. You model things once, you rig it to a skeleton and animate that skeleton to be applied to any cosmetic, and viewed from whatever angle you like. The bad news is 3D just ain't as charming as 2D, let alone fit with our existing style. So that's the problem we needed to solve. Could we have our 2.5D cake and eat it too? What do? We fake it. And the first step to faking something is to have a really good target to hit. And this means just a lot of concept and previs. The more problems you can solve at the concept phase accounts for untold time savings later on in the pipeline. So it's always best to not jump ahead too soon until you're absolutely confident that you have the right solution. I went about this by drawing the same two characters, a boy and a girl, probably a dozen times. And each time I rendered the characters using the same brushes and style that we used for our props. At this point, I wasn't even concerned at all about how I had achieved this in the end, but rather just rendering the platonic ideal and worry about the technical details later. I did have this interesting constraint though, that a lot of our environment props were already designed according to the proportions of a temporary character that we've been using from an asset pack. So the new character's proportions had to work with those props to avoid just completely starting over. I would take these concepts and crudely just drop them over a game screenshot every once in a while to check to see if we were on the right track before committing to 3D. Each iteration, I narrowed down the style and proportions just a little bit more to what we needed. I also ideally wanted a style that could support a more gender-ambiguous body type so that players could wear and express themselves however they like in a way that still looked great but didn't run into the gender stereotypes and unnecessary compatibility constraints. So I actually sketched out a bunch of different outfits on the body to see how flexible it was. All of these characters are using the exact same body proportions, which I thought ended up being pretty successful. Eventually, we landed on something that we were pretty happy with, so we began modeling it in 3D. When modeling the character, again, I'm not trying to concern myself with the technical details of things like how the cosmetics or customization systems will work. At this point, I'm just trying to make sure we can hit the visual target at all. So we model out the two characters as they are drawn as accurately as possible. The biggest challenge with getting the characters to feel consistent with our 2D style is our use of outlines. The outlines aren't just a single color like black, but rather a critical part of our rendering style, which uses darker, often more saturated, hue-shifted versions of the colors they're enclosing. We could handle most of this purely in the texturing for the interior line work, but when it came to the outlines, we needed a shader-based solution that would work from any angle. Now, outlines are sort of a well-explored domain in games, but honestly, most of the solutions either didn't quite work for what we needed, had strange artifacts that I didn't like, or was just too technically complex to implement at the time. Eventually, out of sheer frustration, I decided to see how far I can get purely with a Fresnel-based approach. Fresnel is often used in games for things like rim lighting, where it brightens the pixels at glancing angles of a surface. This was popularized by games like Super Mario Galaxy. The idea here is that we can use the same glancing angle of a surface to instead determine where an outline should be. If the glancing angle is beyond some threshold, then you're in an outline and we could do whatever processing to the colors that we'd like there. And to my surprise, it worked quite well, especially for how cheap it was. So I take the Fresnel effect, apply a little bit of noise to match the brushes we use in our texturing style, and apply a smooth step function to basically threshold it into a proper outline. The Edge 1 and Edge 2 inputs allow me to control things from the material like outline thickness and softness that I can fine-tune on a case-by-case basis. I process it a little bit further so that my outline color can be brighter on the top-facing edges, which is also something that we do in our illustration style. And finally, we use that as a mask to lerp between the character's main color and the desired outline color. That outline color could come from a separate texture map to perfectly control the result when we author the asset, but I found that simply doing a little bit of color processing does the job well enough with much less burden on the artist, so it's a worthy trade-off. The one downside of using Fresnel is the outline thickness varies greatly based on the curvature of the surface. For example, if you have a large, gradually curving surface like the head, you'll get a pretty decent sized outline, but on more detailed areas like the fingers, which curve very quickly, the outline thickness becomes super thin. And in the most extreme case, any hard edge like the edge of a shirt or the brim of a cap will basically have zero thickness. For those extreme cases, we can simply include those lines in the texture map as though they were any other interior line. But for the rest, we needed some way to normalize the thickness to be a little bit more consistent. The solution I came up with is to use vertex colors to modulate the thickness. In areas where the thickness might be a little too thin, like the hands, I simply paint into the vertex color to weight the outline a little more heavily there. At this point, I was pretty happy with how close we were getting to the target, so we turned our attention to customization. Our character models were completely static with everything baked directly into the asset. So we needed to break them down into parts so that players could customize them however they want. And this falls into two major categories: clothing, cosmetics, and facial features. For clothing, we ended up with a pretty robust system where we model out each item separately and skin it to a copy of the same skeleton that the body uses. At runtime, we have a script that iterates over the bones in the main skeleton and copies the transforms to each bone in the cosmetic item the character is wearing. You might be asking, why couldn't we just skin all the cosmetic items directly to the same skeleton? And the answer is 3 reasons. First, it's a production nightmare. You see, the easiest way to achieve this, and the way that I see a lot of asset packs achieving it, is by skinning all of the cosmetic assets to the same skeleton in the same file. So when you import this into Unity, it just works and you simply hide the parts that you don't want visible. The problem with that is it's a nightmare when working with a team. If everyone making cosmetics all need to touch the same file, you end up with conflicts galore and a lot of frustration and ultimately lost work. And even then, you run into issues at scale. Since it's all in the same asset, Unity would need to load every single cosmetic item, regardless if it's being used or not. And when we're talking about a life sim with potentially hundreds or maybe even thousands of cosmetic options, this becomes way too much. Secondly, Unity just makes this a pain in the butt. On the skin mesh renderer component, it does have a field that lets you pick the skeleton it's referencing, so you might assume that you could just point it at the master skeleton and call it a day. But you'd be a fool! Unity actually hides extra data not exposed in the inspector, which retains its reference to the original skeleton. So it's just not going to behave how you expect. I don't even want to talk about how long I spent trying to figure that one out. And the last reason is it actually limits some pretty neat things you can do. If they were all skinned to the same skeleton, then every part naturally would be limited to that exact skeleton. You couldn't do things like have physics bones driving ponytails or fun edge cases like tails or wings. Or you could, but again, you would have to pay the price for all of those extra bones regardless if they're being used or not. Character customization systems also need to account for a lot of edge cases. If you wear puffy boots, they might look fine with the skirts, but when worn with pants, they might clip into the geometry in a way that feels broken and limits creativity. But those same boots might also look completely fine when wearing other pants, like leggings that tuck into the boots. So to solve this, we needed a way to hide certain parts of items conditionally based on the usage of other parts. So we came up with a system that we call zone hiding. The idea is each part can have a list of zones that it wants to hide on another part location. For example, on the pants, we could simply add a zone hider that hides any zone called boot upper on the footwear slot. And if the footwear has that zone, it will be hidden. The zones are defined in a zone map, which is just another texture for the cosmetic where each pixel's value is a zone index. This allows us to quickly add new zones whenever we need, when new edge cases inevitably pop up. We also use a similar setup to hide parts of the body underneath the cosmetics, which is particularly useful for tight-fitting items, which would otherwise show skin clipping through as they animate. For further customization, we have a system of player-defined parameters on parts, most commonly used for customizing things like the color of a shirt, but really it's for any type of property we can imagine, which actually brings us to the face. For the face, we knew that we needed a lot of customization options. Players tend to spend countless hours customizing their characters, and it's often cited as the most frustrating feature of a game when they can't fully express themselves. I was really inspired by Nintendo's Mii character creator, or even Animal Crossing's, which both largely used 2D features mapped to the face, which allowed for a lot of expression while not also stumbling into that uncanny valley that typical character creation systems do. And the 2D approach fit extremely well with our goals and our style. So the plan was to leverage flipbook textures for the facial features like the eyes, the brows, and mouth, where each texture was a new shape type, and each cell within the texture were animation frames that we can use in our character animations. Players could select the shape, but also customize its position, scale, and rotation on the face to capture a lot of different looks. Most systems that do something like this tend to use little transparent billboards that sit in front of the head shape, but I wanted something much more flexible. So we chose to composite the facial features directly onto the head. And we do this by transforming the head's UVs in a shader. I'll spare you the math, but a good way to think about it is a little counterintuitive. Instead of positioning the facial feature to be where we want it to be on the face, instead we use math to shift the face around where we want it to be relative to the facial feature. To make this easier on myself, I made a nifty little subgraph that lets me just plug in all the relevant details like the UVs, the desired position, rotation and scale offsets, and the animation frame that I want, and it spits out new UVs that I can just plug into our texture sampler to draw the part where we want. For the eyes, things get a little more complex because in addition to drawing the shape of the eye, we also need to draw the iris inside of it. Now, we could have just baked this into the texture itself. This is actually what Animal Crossing does, I believe, but it makes the characters just feel a bit soulless. So much of human expression is in the eyes, and if we were going to make a life sim about people, I wanted the ability to fully animate the iris. I also added a slight bit of parallax to the position of the iris and the highlight to give the illusion that the eyes had some roundness or dimensionality to them despite being completely flat in the face. It's subtle, but I think it has a huge impact. Putting this all together and you can get a lot of fun combinations. All that's left to do at this point is to bring them to life with animation. A fun fact about our game, our props, in addition to their own animations, actually contain the character animations needed to use them. This allows us to more easily add new props to the game and even eventually support modding in the future. Every time a character goes to use a prop, the prop tells the character what animations it should plug in, which are defined in 3 parts: begin, loop, and end. For any animation that is instantaneous, like flushing a toilet, we just skip the begin and loop phase and jump to the end. But for other animations like sitting, we might use all 3, where the begin is the transition from standing to sitting, the loop is the sitting itself, and the end is the transition back to standing. We use that same setup for character-to-character animations as well, for social interactions like talking, high-fiving, and hugging. A huge part of the game is actually simulating the reactions and emotions that auras feel when these sorts of things happen, and we want to be able to visually convey that to a player as well. So for all of the characters' core animation states, like idling and walking and talking, we actually create multiple versions of them, each with a different emotionally charged state. So you can be sad and mope around, or get really angry and stomp and yell when talking. It should be very clear what any given character is feeling just by looking at their body language. We call these emotion states, and we plan to support roughly 6 of them: happy, mad, sad, affectionate, confident, and anxious. But we all know that humans feel a heck of a lot more than just 6 emotions, so we're modeling them as a hierarchy. Within any emotion state, which is a fairly broad category, we support many sub-emotions as reaction animations that lead into those emotion states whenever a character changes their emotion. For example, if a character is offended, we could play a quick reaction emote for being offended, and then transition to the more general mad emotion state. This way we can fairly cheaply support a lot of emotions, since the reaction emotes don't need to support all of the locomotion animations like the emotion states do. So that covers most of the basics. There's a ton of details that I glossed over, but this video is already getting super long and we're getting ready to head to GDC to show off our demo to publishers. Often we do playtests with our own community, so if you'd like to get a sneak peek of it and keep up to date with the latest developments, feel free to join our Discord. We're actively there pretty much 24/7. Also, remember to subscribe and comment below if you'd like to see more of this sort of content. They take a long time to make, and often we kind of forget to pull ourselves out of the development trenches to talk about what we're doing. I'll see you next time.